You know what? I think I'll take a look at how my latest video did. Wonder what the response on that was. And oh god, the tankies, they've gone completely out of control. They're in full rage mode. How many memes are there? How many response videos are there to this? Is that Jason? Did Jason do a response to me? No. This has gone too far. I think it's time. We're gonna break out the ultimate source of power. Hold on. Okay, let's do this. Now, as most of you are probably aware, my latest video garnered quite a bit of a response, particularly from the tankies of the online left. Not only did we get several response videos in a week, but the entirety of tanky Discord and Twitter have been going absolutely mental. Jason fucking Unruhe has done a response to me. I almost want to say I've been noticed by Senpai. But on top of that, we also have TheFinnishBolshevik, who's made a response video to us as well. So, you know, that guy debated Sargon and Co. alongside with Bad Mouse. So we're gonna be watching those two videos today, and yeah, it's gonna be a lot of fun. It should be good. Now, the Jason one, I do believe, is a bit shorter. It's let me just see. For fuck's sake, 2.5 minutes long. In response to a 20-minute video. Okay, well, it won't take long at least. Let's get started.
Xexizy has created a video saying that the USSR was not socialist. Basically, he repeated ANCOM talking points. His main point being there was commodity production.
You hear that, guys? I'm an ANCOM now. So, okay, to get this gag to work then, should I also be wearing my fucking Antifa, like, cosplay while sitting in this chair? Like, make up your fucking minds, guys. Like, come on. I was a Trotskyist and then a leftcom and now an anarchist. It's just... Is this what it feels like to be a radical centrist? Because I hate it. I really hate it.
Now, before I refute the actual claim in itself, I think it's important to point out that he has a giant video, Socialism Does Work, where every single example that he gives, there's commodity production. And in some cases, there's more market relations than there was in the Soviet Union, as with the case of Tito and Yugoslavia. So he's outright contradicting himself.
Okay, so yeah, let's deal with the Socialism Has Worked video, because I probably should have said something about this in my original video, because this got thrown in my face quite a bit. But basically, so about a year ago, if anyone doesn't know, I made a video called Socialism Has Worked, right? And what this video was intended to do was sit liberals down and tell them, hey, did you know that socialist revolution outside of Russia, China, North Korea, etc. existed? And you know, just kind of explain a brief, like, you know, 2.5 minute things about these concepts. Not concepts, events rather. And you know, at the time I was painting them as genuine examples of socialism. I said they had established socialism to then later be crushed by external force like fascism or armies of some particular or whatever. Obviously in my latest video though, that completely contradicts me saying these examples of socialism. And yeah, it does. So the thing is, that video was made like about a year ago now, maybe over a year ago, I think. Yeah, no, well over a year ago. And my views have obviously developed since then. But even at the time, there were instances I was including that I kind of knew myself at the time wasn't really socialism, like Yugoslavia or Nestor Makhno's Free Territory. Fucking hell, I regret putting that one in. But nonetheless, I made it not to have the nuances of Marx that liberals just do not give a shit about. I made it to have an almost overwhelming a list of examples for these people who otherwise knew literally nothing about them. It was basically propaganda, and you know, I'll admit that. So it's not there to be theoretically 100% accurate. It's just as a way of getting people out of this socialism is the USSR and that's it mindset. So I still think it's a useful video that does that serves that purpose. But obviously now, especially, and even then, I don't 100% agree with everything that was said in it. But that, again, it wasn't the purpose of that. So that's that cleared up. Again, yeah, maybe I should have said something in the original video, but I wasn't even thinking about that at the time, really, because again, it was so long ago. Like, but it is, because it has like 50,000 views. Is what I'm kind of known for. So maybe I should have realized that. But nonetheless, let's continue.
Now, the USSR was socialist because the economic mechanisms didn't perpetuate inequality, like the concentration of capital into private hands of individuals who used it to increase their social position, because the profits went to the state.
You hear that, guys? Profits went to the state. That's so... Jason, you do realize that in admitting that, you're essentially completely negating any notion that the USSR may have been socialist. To say that there were profits to begin with. I mean, how is that not state capitalism? Producing goods and then selling them for a profit that then goes to the state, as you just said. And the thing is, obviously I could go into way more detail about why that makes no sense. For instance, you know, commodity production, the law of value existing, fucking all of that stuff. But we're going to save that for later on. So I just wanted to kind of point out how ridiculous that is.
Now, Soviet socialism, especially under the 5-year plans, created a new, never-before-seen way of extracting a surplus, a non-capitalist way of doing it.
Oh, a socialist way of extracting surplus value. Holy shit. What is this? What is going on here? I mean, I'm sorry, but if someone told me you were a conservative and describing socialism, if it wasn't for that ridiculous LARPing getup, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Okay? Like, this is just fucking ridiculous.
The surplus product would be directed by a state plan into other enterprises to boost those particular sectors. They could be given to people who were disabled or handicapped. In other words, they were not allocated by market forces.
Again, what you're doing is conflating all capitalism, the capitalist mode of production, with liberal democracy. That's all you're doing here. You're saying, oh, well, there were no markets. Okay, there don't need to be markets. Simple as that. The thing is, well, you talk about how there were no capitalists, no private capitalists involved, so therefore it wasn't capitalism. And I dealt with that specifically in the video. I had a section devoted to that where I talk about class property. And I'm fairly certain, Jason, you haven't even seen my video. Do you know what I think has happened, guys? I think Jason just woke up one morning, okay, after masturbating to Mal the previous night, and he's just heard that someone said the USSR wasn't socialist, and he got out his pre-made notes on all of this shit. He just got on a random video for that day, because I guess he didn't have anything else to talk about, and just read off fucking like bullet points on the list that he's done 1 billion times already without even thinking about them or hearing anybody's feedback on them, and then just said, oh, fucking BTFO. No, you haven't even watched my fucking video, and if you have, then you were watching it with a blindfold. I'm sorry, but there's no way that you vaguely, in the slightest, understood anything that I've been saying, because you haven't been listening to me. So what the fuck is wrong with you? Why do you even bother? Then again, what do you really expect from someone like Jason, who literally says that transphobia doesn't exist because the third world is exploited, and therefore he's allowed to intentionally misgender people whenever he likes? Yeah, that makes sense. Next up is the actual real video response, just consider that part of warm-up, to TheFinnishBolshevik, who actually took time and effort to watch my video, do research, and then come up with arguments against them relevant to the video. Isn't that nice? I just didn't realize that was a bar to be set these days, but what do you know? That's not to say, though, that he didn't still make some personal attacks towards me. He seems to think that all of my arguments are coming from an irrational fear of the USSR, and that I don't actually believe them or something, or that I have a scheme or something. But the thing is, I actually quite like TheFinnishBolshevik. I think he comes from a place of intellectual honesty. So I'm just gonna pretend that, you know, I'm just gonna ignore that. I'm not gonna deal with all that stuff, because I genuinely do think that we can come to some kind of understanding here. So I'm hoping that you know, I'm gonna respond to this in good faith, and I do hope TheFinnishBolshevik, you will be watching in good faith. But nonetheless, let's continue. For the sake of brevity, I'm just going to be getting Finnball's main points and going off them one by one. Maybe I'll do like a stream on my second channel where I actually do watch along with his video, and then I can nitpick every little comment, because, you know, that's always fun. But I don't really want to do that here. So yeah, we're just going to get into the main points and do that. The first off, class property. Now, while this isn't a point that Finnball specifically responded to, it's still very relevant to lots of other themes that come up in his argument throughout the video. And while I did explain this in my original video, I am starting to think that maybe I wasn't that clear about it. So basically what I'm going to do now is just straight up read the section of the article that I got this from, I got these ideas from. So hopefully that will explain it clearer, and it's just, yeah, we'll do that. In the course of its development, capitalist production reaches a stage where its agencies of accumulation are such that capital has to be freed from individual private property and transformed into property of the associated capitalists, thereby inaugurating directly social capital, of course, with all its contradictions. The first form of capitalist collective Marx discerns in share capital, showing the separation between ownership of means of production and the process of production itself, where within the capitalist mode of production itself, there occurs the abolition of private property in the means of production. A second form of capitalist collective, with capitalists as the functionaries of capital and not its own individual owners, is represented by the state itself as a capitalist producer with its product as a commodity, though its employment of productive wage labour. On the other hand, at a particular stage of capital accumulation, the centralisation of capital would reach such a last limit where the total national capital would constitute only a single capital in the hands of a single capitalist, as Marx notes in the French versions of Capital Volume 1. This single capitalist, we might add, could very well be the state, given the existence of the state as a capitalist. Thereby, capital would attain its complete liberation from all constraints of individual private property. However, capital as a specific property relation, reflecting its property relation, remains invariant under these different and changing property forms of capital. In other words, from a Marxian perspective, even in the complete absence of private property in the means of production of the Leninist sense, capitalism could continue to exist. On the other hand, capitalist private property has another and more profound meaning in Marx and Engels, which does not figure in Lenin's discussion. Here, private property is the same as class property, which could subsume individual as well as collective capitalist property. As Marx puts it, it is the private property of a part of society. Here, the means of production are monopolized by a direct part of society. Thus, when the Communist Manifesto declares that the communists can sum up their theory in a single expression, abolition of private property, the latter is expressly used in the sense of disappearance of class property. In the same vein, Marx writes almost 2.5 decades later, "The Commune," they exclaim, "intends to abolish property, the basis of civilization. Yes, gentlemen, the Commune intends to abolish class property, which makes the labor of the many the wealth of the few." It is evident that Marx here makes the abolition of capitalism conditional upon the abolition of capitalist private property, not in the mere sense of individual private property. In this fundamental sense, capitalist private property is identical with its opposite, that is, labourers' non-property, in the means of production, and entirely coinciding with capitalist property relation, continues to exist as long as capitalist production exists, even when the latter has eliminated private property in the means of production in the sense of Lenin, that being individual private property. So, to reiterate, Marx seeks the abolition of class property, that being any property used to produce commodities. I just want everyone to keep that in mind as we go through TheFinnishBolshevik's arguments during this video, because it's something that will be relevant a lot. Right, now we're going to deal with commodity production under socialism, and Finbol, I'm afraid you seem to have fallen into the same trap that every other ML has fallen into while trying to respond to my video, in that you've actually missed out the meat of the video. The core of this video was meant to explain the differences between private and social labour, how it's abolished under socialism, therefore how the law of value is also abolished, and how commodities can only take the form of value through this distinction of private and social labour. Now, you haven't objected to private labour not existing under socialism. So we're going to assume here that we both agree that under socialism, the means of production would be owned and maintained by society in some way, and that the means of production would be used to produce goods directly useful for society. Now from here I want to take a bit of a detour, but it will loop back, I swear. We're going to look at the commodity under capitalism. Now, value is a social relation. It's what the commodity takes on to exit the realm of private labour and enter social labour, to take on a social character and relate to the rest of society. In order to leave the realm of private labour, a commodity must take on value to become social labour. This is the purpose of value under capitalism. Now, abstract labour, that being labour done to produce goods that aren't directly used by the labourer themselves, is the substance of value but not value itself. It only takes the form of value in a commodity when that commodity becomes social labor. To quote Marx, human labor power in motion, or human labor, creates value, but it is not itself value. It becomes value only in its congealed state, when embodied of the form of some object. Again, the embodiment of value in that object only takes place in the transition from private to social labor. Under socialism, when the distinction between private and social labor has been abolished, goods can no longer take on the form of value to relate to society. They don't need to. They already have a social character from the outset, as all labor is directly social. As products can no longer take on the form of value to relate to society, the law of value ceases to exist, as you'd imagine. Even Stalin admits that the law of value must exist where there is commodity production, yet, as I've just explained, value cannot exist under socialism. And this is admitted by Engels multiple times in Anti-Düring. As Stalin admits that there is commodity production, therefore there is the law of value, when we're about to see that Engels says value doesn't exist under socialism, surely this must tell you that the USSR is not socialist. But anyway, let's get into the quotes. It is true that even then, that being in the socialist society, it will still be necessary for society to know how much labor each article of consumption requires for its production. It will have to arrange its plan of production in accordance with the means of production, which include in particular its labor powers. The useful effects of the various articles of consumption compared with one another and with the quantities of labor required for their production will in the end determine the plan. People will be able to manage everything very simply without the intervention of much vaunted value. And secondly, for socialism, which wants to emancipate human labor power from its status as a commodity, the realization that labor has no value and can have none is of great importance. And of course, I'd imagine it follows from there that if labor has no value, then the law of value does not exist. So even though under socialism, means of consumption are exchanged for labor vouchers, this does not constitute commodity production in the slightest. The quotes I've given here show that to say that commodity production can exist under socialism is in direct contradiction with what Marx and Engels say. If, of course, you accept that commodity production necessitates the existence of the law of value, which you do. This is then completely ignoring the fact that exchange of means of consumption under socialism for these labor vouchers has no profit generation or capital accumulation at all. I'm sorry, but to say that any kind of exchange constitutes commodity production is a very serious misunderstanding of Marxism. And I don't want to start berating you with insults here. I'm not trying to act high and mighty, but I'm sorry, but this just completely shows a lack of understanding for these concepts. I'm going to leave two articles in the description. One is this Japanese article I keep referring to, which I also linked in my original video, and another is comparing Lenin and Marx's conception of socialism, which I also left in my previous video. And Finbol, I implore you to read these, I really do, because they're going to explain everything that I'm talking about much more clearly. But even with my subpar explanations, I'd say that it's clear that you're just wrong here. I'm sorry, but whatever. I will try to stop being so smug here, because I'm not intending to be. I swear, I'm genuinely being honest here. But okay, let's move on. One thing in particular I wanted to deal with as well was TheFinnishBolshevik quoted several parts from Critique of the Gopher program, and throughout the video, and really I just felt like he was misunderstanding these and misusing these a bit, so I kind of wanted to go through the two quotes that he used and explain why he's using them wrong. So the first quote that he brings up is, "In the society based on the common ownership of the means of production, producers do not exchange their products." And Finbol tells us that we shouldn't be taking this literally, and I do ask, how should we take it? And he's saying that Marx is only actually referring to individual exchange of commodities. And he backs this up with the second part of the quote. "Since now, in contrast to capitalist society, individual labor no longer exists in an indirect fashion, but directly as a component part of the total labor." So it seems what Finbol is trying to say here is that Marx, again, he's referring to individual production and exchange of commodities, private individual exchange. But on a societal level, this is okay, or at least I'd say he's implying that on a societal level, the production and exchange of commodities is okay by Marx. But what we have here then is Marx saying production under socialism doesn't happen, and then FinnBol coming along and saying, actually, Marx is only talking about the specific type of exchange rather. But the second part of the quote is only talking about labor being directly social, and that's explaining why exchange to begin with doesn't exist anymore. Exchange in the sense of commodities. As, like I've already outlined, the transition from private to social labor is the method that commodities take on to relate to society, and it's that exchange that they make. So therefore, when labor is already directly social, you no longer have any exchange because you don't need to exchange things anymore. Things are already social, but it's exchanged by which things become social under capitalism. To say that commodity exchange can still happen even when labor is directly social, as Marx says, completely ignores how commodities relate to society to begin with. And that is by, again, transitioning from private to social labor. And again, so if labor is directly social, then you don't need to transition from private to social labor because private labor doesn't exist anymore. Now, FinnBol also brings up this other quote to justify why commodity production exists under communism. Here, obviously, the same principle prevails as that which regulates the exchange of commodities, as far as this is exchange of equal values. However, literally continuing on from this quote straight after, explains why it's absolutely ridiculous to use this quote in defense of his argument. So Marx continues to say from there, content and form are changed because under the altered circumstances, no one can give anything except his labor, and because, on the other hand, nothing can pass into the ownership of individuals except individual means of consumption. But as far as the distribution of the latter among the individual producers is concerned, the same principle prevails as in the exchange of commodity equivalents. So much labor in one form is exchanged for an equal amount of labor in another form. Now I want to focus in on two parts in this. Firstly, content and form are changed, and there's actually a brilliant extract from that Japanese essay that just explains this perfectly, so we're going to read that. But the fundamental difference pointed out by Marx is that content and form are changed. In other words, labor does not appear as the value of a product in terms of being objectified or as a material trait of the product. In a word, labor is not manifested as value or in the value form. Why is this? He says that there are altered circumstances, i.e. society has already become a society of communal labor where the means of production are commonly owned. This is because no one can give anything except his labor, and because, on the other hand, nothing can pass into the ownership of individuals, except individual means of consumption. The law of value can only arise in a society where the linkage of social labor is carried out through the private exchange of products of private labor. In the case of socialism, however, there is no such exchange of products. No individual has anything of equivalent value. This is because already no one can give anything except his labor. For example, no individual possesses anything akin to a product of individual labor. The products are directly social products, and no individual has a product for exchange. What can be given is only their own labor, and what they can possess is merely the given individual means of consumption distributed by society. And lastly, this part is very quick. Marx says in this quote that the same principle is applied as that in commodity production. That doesn't mean commodity production still exists. It's a much shorter way of saying it, but I wanted to point it out nonetheless. Okay, so dealing with the transitional phase and statelessness. I have no idea where FinnBol got this idea that Marx never talks about a transitional phase. But he says that I've just made up this third phase in between capitalism and socialism to justify my argument somehow. And that Marx never actually talks about it. So we're going to show some quotes where Marx directly talks about that. Between capitalist and communist society, there lies a period of revolutionary transformation of one to the other. Corresponding to this is also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. So this is pretty straightforward. The dictatorship of the proletariat is just the transition from capitalism to socialism. The second quote is as follows. Class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat, and this dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society. So it's obvious here that Marx is talking about the transition from capitalism to lowercase communism, and he refers to this as the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is what I've been referring to all along in my original video, and honestly I would have thought that would have just been assumed. And I also want to use these quotes to back up my argument that communism is stateless, or lowerface communism in particular. We can agree that any society that is classless must also be stateless, because the state is only a tool of class struggle, And without any classes, there can be no class struggle. Therefore, the state has no purpose, it doesn't exist. Marx clearly says that the dictatorship of the proletariat is a transition into a classless society. And while you may be able to say that in that one quote, he's referring to higher phase communism, in the first quote, he just says from capitalism to communism. And of course, to Marx, there is no difference between socialism and communism. They're the same word. Well, not literally the same word, but you get what I mean. If Marx specifically meant higher phase communist society, he would have specified that. But he's just said communist society, and as far as he's concerned, yes, there's lower and higher phase communism, but they're both communism. Furthermore, again, Marx points out that lower phase communism is classless, where in Critique of the Government Program, he says everybody is a worker just like everybody else. How is this not classless? So it's clear that lower phase communism is classless, as Marx has said repeatedly. So from here, the question becomes, does this mean that it is stateless? I would say yes. I would say that is the general understanding. If you want to say, though, that class can exist, if you want to say that the state can exist without class, that's down to you to explain within the Marxist framework. But honestly, I've never seen that done before. And lastly, we're going to be talking about briefly wage labor. As we've already established, the USSR had commodity production. Jason said in his video that the surplus extracted from production was used to aid the people in a socialist manner or whatever. But this admits that wage labor existed. Wage labor is when labor power is sold as a commodity and not necessarily to a private capitalist, as we've explained with our point on class property. We can say that labor power is still a commodity here because it's essentially still going off of the CVS formula, constant, variable, and surplus capital. You can only ever even know what surplus value is if you're aware of what the constant and variable values correspond to. Constant being raw materials used and machinery, and variable being the wages. So that means that wage had a value. And of course that value is going to correspond to the cost of production of the laborer, just like it does as a commodity. Now, as we have a planned economy here, rather than supply and demand leading to fluctuations around this equilibrium point, around this cost of production, we might have things like price fixes leading to that. However, the point is that the cost of production, that value, exists in the first place. And furthermore, to say that price fixes mean that it's not wage labor is pretty much to say that a minimum wage law means it's not wage labor. I mean, in Finland, for example, I'd imagine they have a minimum wage fairly comfortably above the minimum cost of production for the laborer, but they still have wage labor. You cannot have commodity production without wage labor for this reason. Both capital and wage labor are codependent on one another, and capital inherently exists where there is commodity production. It's as simple as that. But anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. I've had a lot of fun responding to Tanky's on this. I've had a lot of fun seeing Tanky's responses to this. Again, I will give TheFinnishBolshevik the props for, again, literally being the only person, I think, other than one other person who I didn't really have time to fit into this response video, to actually put the effort in to make a response. And it's kind of saddening that that's the bar that has to be set for these people. So, you know, but nonetheless, yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I guess I'll see you all next time. China, North Korea, etc.